I want to talk to you about a blind spot in our thinking about happiness. Each year, truckloads of books are published on the topic of happiness, but the vast majority of them share the same blind spot. And I just want to offer an example, and it's actually a terrific book, except it has this blind spot. It's called The Happiness Project. It's by Gretchen Rubin. If you look at the cover already starts to make you a little bit happier. And it's the story of a woman who has a wonderful life. She has a wonderful job, marriage, children, and yet she finds herself seized by a midlife malaise. She has what she calls a recurring feeling of discontent. And so she goes and says, I have to embark on a project to make myself happier. And so she draws widely on the insights of positive psychology, which is a branch of psychology which is devoted to helping well-adjusted people become happier. And through the course of a year, she begins to do different things to make her happier. She decides to go to sleep earlier, something we're not going to be doing tonight, but she decides to go to sleep earlier, to exercise better, to sing in the morning, to read Aristotle, to kiss more. And when the year is over, she is a much happier person. And that's why this is a terrific book. But it's a book with a blind spot. And let me explain to you why. This is what I would call a first world guide to happiness. Gretchen Rubin is the former editor of the Yale Law Review. She's an accomplished author. She's part of a prominent and powerful family. If she has problems, they are first world problems. Now, first world problems can cause people a lot of suffering and anxiety. I've spent plenty of time in my office talking to people with first world problems. But first world problems are something that are only occurring in this era. And this book could not have been written 150 years ago. A few years ago, I read a history of Lincoln's cabinet. And what I was struck by was how tragedy was part of everyday life. Abraham Lincoln's Attorney General, Edward Bates, lost 9 out of 17 children in their youth. His Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, by the time he was aged 45, he had lost 3 wives and 2 children. In the 1850s and 1860s, you couldn't have a brightly colored book that would advise people to sing in the morning and kiss more, and then they would be happier, because their problems were much larger than just singing in the morning. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, okay, but it's not the 1850s. We do live in the 21st century in North America. But that's precisely the blind spot. The blind spot is that we imagine that we are not subject to tragedy, just like they were in the 1850s. But as the Bible reminds us in the book of Kohelet, everybody is subject to the same fate. It doesn't matter how rich and how powerful and how brilliant you are. Every human being suffers the same end as any animal. We all die. We're all vulnerable. We're all mortal. And that's precisely the blind spot. We imagine that we can talk about happiness without grappling with tragedy. And we forget to ask the simple question which sits in that blind spot. How can you be happy in a tragic world? You know, very often when I'm meeting a family before a funeral, so they come and they sit down with me and we talk. And at the outset, there's usually one member of the family that says, Rabbi, we want this to be a celebration of his life. And I'm generally an accommodating guy, and I'm certainly not going to argue with mourners. But I remember once where this statement was made at the very beginning, and it's made at the beginning because that's now the fashion. And then we go through the meeting, and there is laughter, but there's a lot of tears. And at the end, I looked at them and I said, you know, you just lost your dear mother and grandmother. Are you sure that you feel like celebrating? And the reason why everyone has to say it's a celebration of life is because we, in the 21st century, can't look tragedy straight in the face. We can't wrestle with tragedy head to head. And so, of course, we come up with ideas like, oh, no, it's a celebration of life. Let's try to make everything sound antiseptic. Let's try to hide tragedy in the corner. And we'll just talk about how we can sing in the morning. And that's the blind spot. We don't know how to talk about how to be happy in a tragic world. I've been privileged to have teachers who have taught me how to be happy in a tragic world. And I call this the Holocaust Survivor's Guide to Happiness. When I arrived in my synagogue 18 years ago, over half the membership of the synagogue was comprised of survivors and their families. And I've gotten to know those survivors, and sadly, I've had the responsibility over the years to officiate at their funerals. And I have to tell you, what I learned from them is how to be happy in a tragic world. Now, I don't want to romanticize the survivors. Most of them bore heavy emotional scars. Some of them were rendered dysfunctional by their experiences. But what is remarkable is that despite the trauma that they experienced, the vast majority of them were able to rebuild and to thrive. Viktor Frankl, to whom this talk this evening owes a great intellectual debt, Viktor Frankl talks about his struggle within the concentration camp to retain his soul, to be able to love, not to lose his humanity. And after the war, how the survivors thrived. Multiple Nobel Prizes. One of them was a U.S. general who was the commander of NATO forces in Europe. You talk about people who were high-tech innovators, CEOs of major companies, real estate titans. And those are only the famous ones. The survivors thrived, they rebuilt. William Helmreich, in a book, Against All Odds, tries to analyze, what is it? What character traits allowed the survivors to do so unusually well after the Holocaust? And I'd like to offer what I think is the central pillar. What is, if there's going to be a Holocaust survivor's guide to happiness, this is the center of it. This is where it all really begins. It begins with the concept of redemption. What is redemption? It's a concept that, of course, has its roots in the Bible. Redemption means to restore or to fix something that was broken. And so if a poor farmer loses the family farm and his relative comes and buys it back for him, that's been a small moment of redemption. If a young man passes away and a new baby is born and named for that young man, that is a moment of redemption. If a person's soul is damaged and then they find their way to their true inner self, they find what they're supposed to be doing, that's a moment of redemption. And the survivors understood that their lives after the war were dedicated to redemption. And redemption is the only way that you can grapple with finding happiness in a tragic world, because the entire point of redemption is to wrestle with what is broken and to come to fix it. So what does redemption look like? To me, it looks like a shot glass. Doesn't matter if it's empty or full. And I have to tell you about Jack of blessed memory, who was a member of my synagogue. During the war, he lost his mother and one of his brothers. He came over to Montreal. He got married. He had children. He had grandchildren. He built a home. He built a family. He helped build our community. He built a business. So every time Jack would go to a celebration, a bris, a bar mitzvah, a wedding, he would go up to the bar with his friends, and they'd take out shot glasses. And his friends were almost all survivors as well. And Jack would lift up his glass and he would say, L'chaim, to life. And I have to tell you, the look on Jack's face, the twinkle in his eye when he raised his glass to L'chaim, is the definition of what redemption is. This is a man who life had crushed. He should have given up, but instead he rose from the ashes and he rebuilt. And I've been privileged with other survivors to go at a celebration, and because a celebration is such a powerful moment, it really reminds you how you've rebuilt. And I've sat with them and I've had that l'chaim, and there's nothing that tastes as sweet and as precious as that particular l'chaim. And this is what the survivors did. And I've learned it from so many, and I can only mention a few. Like Eddie, the candy man in our synagogue. Eddie had seen too many children suffer during the war. And so he made it his business, number one, in our synagogue, that he's the one who hands out candy to the kids who can't sit straight during the services. Not only that, he is a tireless advocate and supporter of any youth programming, because to him, youth is incredibly precious, because he knows what was broken, and he has to redeem it. Or like Paul. At Paul's funeral, he actually had saved his concentration camp uniform, and he placed it on the casket. He had the family place it on the casket. And Paul walked away from the war feeling a tremendous sense of an injustice being perpetrated. He couldn't get past how horrible things had been, the injustice the Nazis had perpetrated. And so Paul always searched for justice. And in the 1950s and in the 1960s, when he was in real estate in Montreal, and even in Montreal, there was an enormous amount of discrimination. Paul was the one who would rent to black families. And he was getting an enormous amount of pressure. Don't do that. Paul did it anyway. To him, that was his redemption. He wasn't going to allow injustice to follow him from Europe to Montreal. And it's from these survivors that I learned, what does it mean to be happy in a tragic world? How do you find happiness when things are broken? Well, you wrestle. You figure out a way to fix things. You look for redemption. And with redemption, you have the secret of how to be happy in a tragic world. When I sent my notes for this particular talk to Rabbi Strauchler, who deserves, by the way, an enormous hand for the type of work that he did in putting this together this evening. When I sent this to Rabbi Strauchler sent me back and said, well, you should consider talking about what's in it for me. People who are listening, they want to know what's in it for me. Now, I'll leave that to the wisdom of the listener, that perhaps they know where they have their heartbreak, and everybody has their heartbreak. Nobody is bubble wrapped. They know where their heartbreak is. They know where they need to find redemption. But I was thinking about Rabbi Strauchler's suggestion, and I want to tell you what's in it for me, for Chaim Steinmetz. My mother, Rachel Steinmetz, passed away 2.5 years ago. My mother was a survivor of Auschwitz. Her father, my grandfather, died in the death march. She came to the United States. She got married. She had 3 children. She was 8 months pregnant with her 4th child. And then my father died in a car accident. I'm the 4th child who was born a month later. I was told at my mother's funeral by people who remembered when my mother sat Shiva for my father that she made it clear to everyone visiting her that she was going to raise her children and raise them well, that no one had to worry. And I can testify to the fact that she didn't just raise us well, she did an exceptional job. But I want to fast forward a couple of years forward. My mother was already a grandmother and a great-grandmother, but she was also frail. My nephew had a baby boy. The bris, the circumcision, was going to be in Far Rockaway, and my mother lived in Muncie. Driving from Muncie to Far Rockaway takes an hour and a half in the best of times. In the morning traffic, it can take a lot longer. And it's not easy sometimes for someone who is older and weak and frail to wake up early. And it's certainly not easy to spend 2 hours in the car driving. So I made a half-hearted attempt to convince my mother not to go to the bris. Ma, we'll Skype you in. We'll call in. We'll take pictures. Of course, my mother wasn't going to hear anything of it. So she gets in the car and we drive. And then someone opens the door for her. And I have to tell you, I'm never going to forget the first step that she took out of that car. I felt the ground shake. And that step was a step of redemption. That everything my mother had gone through in her life was now worth it because she could celebrate another simcha, another celebration of a great-grandchild. And that's where I saw redemption shake the earth. So what's in it for me? Well, in the past 2.5 years, I'm still heartbroken. But what's in it for me is that I find my redemption in my happiness in being able to share the wisdom and the insights of my own mother's life. And for me, that is redemption. And so I thank you for listening and have a good evening.